"Look," said he, "at the sun and the moon and the planets, and all the rest of those things which are so much greater than we in some respects. To these, freedom in themselves has not been given, but they are also fixed that they can only move in the path marked out for them. The sun cannot say, 'I will not appear at the right time.' The moon cannot say, 'I will not wax and wane.' The stars must rise and set when they are due. The sea cannot help carrying the ships. The mountains and earth cannot help remaining each in its place, for all these things are mere vehicles of the wisdom of God that never goes wrong. If everything was only formed to be useful for something else, for whose benefit would the world be made? Out of the divine kindness it was given to man that the things needful for his life should be his servants during this present dispensation, and that he should conduct himself as he pleases. What is in his power to do, he can do if he pleases, and can leave undone if he pleases. He can, in a word, control himself or fail to control himself, and the praise or blame which his conduct deserves is really his own. See then, continues Bardaisan, how greatly the goodness of God has been exercised towards man, in that so much more freedom has been given to man than to other things, so that by means of it he may control himself, and so act the part of God, and be reckoned with the angels. Before Renaissance philosophers proclaimed the ideal of man as free, rational, and divine, the Christian world had already known such a voice, not from Florence or Padua, but from the banks of the Euphrates. Not at the high noon of humanism, but in the first light of Christian civilization. Before universities, before scholasticism, before creeds had hardened or canon closed. There, in the 2nd century, lived a man named Bardaisan. Philosopher, poet, astrologer, theologian, a polymath really. His legacy would be swept aside, remembered only in hostile citations, whispered accusations, and fragments salvaged from the margins of heresiology. Today, we try to listen again to the voice of a humanist before humanism, a mystic of reason, a rebel against fate. This is the story of Bardaisan of Edessa.
I'm Andy Altshuler, and this is Echoes of Heresy, a podcast about spiritual descent and divergent beliefs across time and tradition.
Before we can understand Bardaisan, we have to understand his world, and that world begins in Edessa. That's the name the city is known in most Western sources. Greek name Edessa is likely of Phrygian or Thracian origin and means somewhat like abundance of water. In its native Aramaic, the city was referred to as Or-Hai, the living light. The city still stands. Today it is Şanlıurfa in southeastern Turkey. Aramaic, or to be precise, its dialect, later defined as Syriac, was the main language of communication there, and what is known as Syriac script was its written expression. In addition to that, Greek Koine, Armenian, Persian, and increasingly Latin were spoken on its streets. In the 2nd century of the Common Era, it was a melting pot of Semitic, Hellenistic, Iranian, and Roman influences. Edessa was a capital of a small kingdom known as Osrini. It was ruled at the time by the Abgarid dynasty, a local royal house that traced its origin to Nabatean and possibly Arab roots. The Abgarids were master diplomats in an age of empires. Caught between the Roman Empire to the west and the Parthian, later Sasanian Empire to the east, they pursued a shrewd balancing act. They were client kings under Rome, but retained a significant degree of autonomy, often switching allegiances depending on which empire held the upper hand in Mesopotamia. This precarious independence made Edessa a haven for religious and philosophical experimentation. Its rulers were tolerant, or at least politically savvy, in allowing various traditions to coexist. One of the oldest legends in Christian literature even places Jesus himself in contact with the Abgarid court. According to a widely circulated story recorded by Eusebius of Caesarea in the 4th century, Abgar V, a king of Edessa in the 1st century, wrote to Jesus asking him to heal an illness. Jesus is said to have replied with a letter promising that after his ascension, one of his disciples would visit the king. While modern historians view this exchange as apocryphal, the legend points to Edessa's early and deep association with Christianity. In fact, King Abgar VIII, known as the Great, converted to Christianity in the late 2nd century, at least nominally. Under his rule, Edessa became the first kingdom to officially adopt Christianity. 100 years before Armenia under Tardad III, and more than 100 years before the conversion of Constantine. In the imagination of later Syriac chroniclers, the Abgars were the 5th or the 8th, often became one. The semi-legendary king who wrote to Jesus and the historical monarch who likely converted to Christianity blurred into a single pious figure, the first Christian king of the East. The reign of Abgar VIII indeed coincided with the flowering of Syriac Christian literature, the appearance of Christian symbols on royal coinage, and growing alignment with Christian communities in and around Edessa. It is important to stress this was not Nicene orthodoxy, that didn't exist yet. Abgar's Christianity likely reflected the local Syriac blend of mysticism, Judaism, and emerging Christian doctrines, not a fully defined theology. Even though Abgar was a Roman client king, his Christian affiliation did not prevent his rule, and Christianity peacefully coexisted with various local Hellenic, Persian, and Mesopotamian cults. Edessa at the time was a thriving trade hub, positioned at the crossroads of major routes connecting the Roman West and the Persian East, the Arabian Peninsula with the Pontic steppe. This is the world Bardaisan was born into, where he lived and wrote. A frontier kingdom, intellectually vibrant, politically agile, and spiritually ungoverned, and already marked by Christian intrigue. Bardesan, or Bar-Daysan, was born in Edessa around year 154 of the Common Era, into a noble family closely associated with the Abgarid court. His name, Bardaisan, means son of the Daysan. It came from the small river Daysan that ran through the city. According to Syriac sources, he was raised with the Prince Abgar VIII receiving a classical Greek education in the royal household. This exposure to both Hellenistic learning and Semitic religious traditions shaped the complex intellectual identity he would carry for the rest of his life. Bardaisan likely converted to Christianity around the same time as King Abgar VIII, possibly slightly earlier. Some later heresiographers, such as Ephraim the Syrian and Eusebius, suggest that he was once associated with Valentinian circles or influenced by Gnostic thought. However, Bardaisan seems to have moved toward a more mainstream Christian position, at least briefly, and was considered part of the proto-Orthodox Christian community of Edessa before eventually developing his own distinct theological system. We know little about Bardaisan's family and personal life, but some chroniclers mention 3 sons, Abgaron, Hasdu, and Harmonius. All 3 are said to have continued and promoted their father's spiritual legacy. Among them, Harmonius became notable in his own right, particularly for his contributions to the development of Syriac Christian hymnody. He is credited with introducing Greek melodic and rhythmic structures into Syriac hymns, thereby helping to shape the distinct musical tradition of the Syriac Church. While Bardaisan is remembered or condemned for his unorthodox theology, it is important to first understand him as a polymath. His intellectual curiosity ranged far beyond matter of doctrine. He engaged deeply with astronomy, cosmology, ethnography, geography, music, and history, earning a reputation as one of the most wide-ranging minds of his age. His now lost works reportedly include treatises on the structure of the heavens, the movement of the stars, and the varieties of human custom. One of the few surviving texts directly connected to Bardaisan is the Book of the Laws of the Countries, preserved in Syriac and likely systematized by his disciples, particularly one known as Philip. This dialogue between Bardaisan and an astrologer named Awida is among the earliest extant works of Syriac Christian literature. It wrestles with the relationship between fate and free will, exploring how human behavior is shaped by factors such as astral influence, geography, cultural environment, and tradition, yet ultimately defined by free will, which connects the human soul to a transcendent God. In the course of this wide-ranging and deep dialogue, Bardaisan offers numerous examples of how laws and customs vary across regions. A fusion of ethnography, natural philosophy, and theology that showcases his encyclopedic knowledge and global curiosity. What is especially striking is the broader ethnographic vision embedded in the work. Bardaisan catalogues the customs, laws, and worldviews of peoples as far apart as the Britons in the West and the Chinese in the East. The treatise thus offers a rare glimpse into the boundaries of the known world and the state of geographical and cultural awareness in the intellectual milieu of Edessa. It is especially worth noting Bardaisan's transmission of information about India. Among early Christian writers, he stands out as possibly the first to introduce substantial knowledge of India into the Greco-Roman and Syriac intellectual worlds. His references to Indian customs, religious practices, and philosophical ideas were not idle curiosities. They reflect real contact, whether direct or mediated, with Indian thought. These accounts were preserved in Syriac and later transmitted through Arabic sources, playing a formative role in how the Islamic world conceptualized India long before the monumental 11th century work of al-Biruni. Bardaisan's observations, though filtered through later compilers, helped shape the early stages of the Arab-Persian encyclopedic traditions, which sought to understand India's complex spiritual landscape. In this sense, Bardaisan was a cultural mediator, linking South Asian religio-philosophical ideas, including perhaps traces of Buddhism or Vedanta, to the cosmopolitan intellectual networks of the late Roman Near East. Bardaisan's efforts to integrate Indian material, however fragmentary, represent a rare and early conduit through which such ideas may have traveled westward. He was not merely commenting on foreign cultures. He was part of a late antique world where cross-cultural transmission was active, dynamic, and sometimes disruptive. His enduring influence across religious and linguistic boundaries, Syriac, Greek, and Arabic, speaks to his role as a pan-cultural thinker, someone who saw truth as a multifaceted gem refracted through many lands and tongues. In another age, Bardaisan might have been remembered as a sage or a universal historian. It was only the narrowing margins of orthodoxy that cast him instead as a heretic. Now let's move to Bardaisan's theological vision. Was the universe governed by the necessity or by freedom? Was fate a law or a lie? These were not idle questions for Bardaisan. They were the battle lines of the soul. At the heart of Bardaisan's theology stood a defense of human free will. Living in a world captivated by astrology, where celestial movements were thought to dictate the course of empires and the fates of man, Bardaisan insisted that human beings possess real moral agency. The stars might influence, but they do not control. Bardaisan rejects the idea that astrological determinism absolves people of responsibility. He argues that if destiny were fixed by the stars, there would be no room for virtue, law, or justice. Instead, he affirms a tripartite view of causality. Human action is shaped by nature, custom, and free will. Among these, free will is paramount. Bardaisan's theological universe is not neatly ordered. It is marked by tension, a kind of cosmic dualism, though not an absolute one. He taught that God is supremely good and the creator of the world, yet evil exists as a real and opposing force, resisting divine order. This places him somewhere between radical dualists like Manichaeans and the emerging orthodoxy of Christian monotheism in his time. He envisions a cosmic drama in which divine light gradually overcomes darkness, and where humanity must choose between aligning with the divine or falling under the sway of chaotic, resistant forces. In this drama, Jesus Christ plays a salvific role, though Bardaisan's Christology likely differed from what would later be defined as orthodox. His teachings suggest a more symbolic or cosmic role for Christ, possibly emphasizing enlightenment, healing, and restoration over atonement through sacrificial death. In this respect, Bardaisan's theology bears affinities with the Jewish apocalyptic tradition, early Christian gnosis, and even Zoroastrian and Indian cosmologies, traditions in which history is a battleground between truth and illusion, and where the liberation of the individual soul from cosmic determinism is more prominent than the theme of Christ's redemptive sacrifice. As I said, Bardaisan does not reject astrology entirely. He grants that the stars have influence, but their power is secondary, not sovereign. The soul remains answerable to God and capable of choice. This view allowed him to retain cosmological sophistication while affirming moral responsibility. It also let him speak to both Hellenistic elites and Semitic believers bridging traditions that often stood apart. Some modern scholars see Bardaisan's thought as a Gnostic adjacent system, a kind of moderate dualism that incorporates esoteric cosmology with denying creation's essential goodness. Others argue that he remains firmly within a Christian monotheistic framework, albeit with speculative edges. It is reasonable to draw parallels between Bardaisan's thought and the intellectual ethos of Renaissance humanism. Bardaisan emphasized individual agency, a rational inquiry into the cosmos, and the human capacity to understand and, in a sense, align with the forces of nature and the universe. At the same time, he remained broadly committed to core Christian tenets, however unorthodox his theology may appear in hindsight. These qualities position Bardaisan as a kind of intellectual forerunner to later figures like Marsilio Ficino or Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, thinkers who likewise sought to recognize religious belief with philosophical inquiry and human freedom. While separated by over a millennium, both Bardaisan and the Renaissance humanists shared an impulse to harmonize spiritual insight with a reasoned inquiry, a trait that makes Bardaisan's work feel strikingly modern in its philosophical ambition. Bardaisan's theological speculations did not go unnoticed by the emerging Orthodox establishment. While he remained a respected figure in Edessa during his lifetime, indeed enjoying a measure of courtly esteem, his legacy was swiftly reinterpreted through the lens of heresy by later Christian authors. Eusebius of Caesarea, in his ecclesiastical history, acknowledges Bardaisan as a man of culture and eloquence, but groups him among those who deviated from apostolic truth. More forceful is the Syriac poet theologian Ephraim the Syrian, writing in the 4th century, who composed entire hymn cycles against the Daysanites. In these poetic polemics, Ephraim accuses Bardaisan of corrupting Christian doctrine with astrological fatalism and metaphysical speculation. Though Bardaisan was never formally condemned by an ecumenical council, he became a recurring name in the patristic heresiological tradition. In Epiphanius of Salamis Panarion against heresies, Bardaisan is mentioned in section 56, grouped among Christian dualists and philosophers whose teachings verge on Gnostic cosmology. Epiphanius attributes to Bardaisan a number of doctrinal errors, including confusion about the origin of evil and the over-reliance on astrological causality. Eventually, Bardaisan's name came to circulate in lists of heresiarchs alongside Marcion, Valentinus, and Mani, reflecting a broader anxiety of a speculative theology and hybrid cosmologies. Even after Bardaisan's death, his intellectual and poetic legacy continued to ripple across Mesopotamia. His followers, Bardeisanites, persisted well into the 4th century and possibly beyond, often inhabiting an ambiguous space within the broadest Syriac Christian world. To their critics, they were heretical imitators of orthodoxy, deceptively close in language and liturgy, yet dangerous in doctrine. Mention Ephraim the Syrian, perhaps their most passionate opponent, particularly warned against the seductive power of their hymns, which retained Christian terminology but infused it with speculative cosmology. Ephraim's polemical hymns make clear that music and poetry were central to Bardaisanite practice, tools not just of devotion but of persuasion. Unlike Marcionites or Manichaeans, however, the Bardeisanites did not evolve into a highly structured sect with strict dualistic doctrines or a sharply defined ecclesiology. Instead, they appear to have functioned more like a fluid intellectual movement blurring the lines between Christian piety, Hellenistic philosophy, and mystical cosmology. Their teachings likely survived not in formal creeds, but in songs, dialogues, and commentaries, transmitted through households, local gatherings, and schools. As Bardaisan's teachings faded from the mainstream of Syriac Christianity, echoes of his legacy found curious afterlives in the texts of early Islamic heresiographers. In Arabic sources from the 9th to 12th centuries, Bardaisan's followers are remembered not as Christians, but as members of a strange and somewhat ill-defined sect, al-Daysaniya, named after their founder's association with the river Daysan. Writers such as al-Nawbahti and al-Shahrastani classify the Daysaniya as the al-Ahwa, the people of deviant desires, or heterodox sectarians. They portray the group as dualists holding a cosmology in which light and darkness were co-eternal or opposed principles. Some reports suggest that Daysaniya believed that the material world resulted from the intermingling of two primordial forces, a theme reminiscent of both Gnostic myth and Zoroastrian cosmology. In some sources, they are conflated with other fringe sects, such as Marqiyuniya, followers of Marcion, Manichaeans, or minor currents within the Sabians of Haran. The Islamic authors rarely differentiate Bardaisanite doctrine with precision. Daysanis are more often used as a rhetorical category, placed in the shadowy borderlands of theology and folklore. Despite this, their appearance in multiple Islamic encyclopedic works suggests a long afterlife for Bardaisan's reputation, not as a Christian thinker, but as a philosopher of cosmic dualism lingering in the memories of late antique thought systems. Now let's talk about the place of this unique thinker in modern scholarship. For much of ecclesiastical history, Bardaisan remained a shadowy figure, dismissed as a heretic and mentioned only in the margins of polemic literature. But with the modern rediscovery of Syriac texts and a deeper interest in non-orthodox Christianities, Bardaisan has emerged as a significant voice in the study of late antique religion, philosophy, and poetry. His book of the Laws of Countries has been increasingly the subject of philological, theological, and philosophical analysis, praised for its clear articulation of the problem of fate, free will, and human responsibility in a universe governed by divine order and natural law. Among the scholars who have led this reappraisal, we should mention first and foremost Dutch historian Han Drivers, perhaps the most comprehensive modern authority on Bardaisan. His studies, including monograph Bardaisan of Edessa, first published in 1966, and numerous articles, reconstruct Bardaisan's life and teachings not as a deviation from orthodoxy, but as a creative synthesis of Christian theology, Platonic cosmology, and local Mesopotamian traditions. Drivers emphasizes Bardaisan's role as a court intellectual, deeply embedded in the cultural politics of Edessa. If you want to dive deep into the text itself of the Book of the Laws of Countries, there is an open access translation as of 2018 by Anthony Alcock. It is available online. It is featuring both Syriac and English texts. Sebastian Brock, a leading figure in Syriac studies, draws attention to Bardaisan's poetic innovations, especially his influence on the development of Syriac hymnody. While often focused on Ephraim, Brock acknowledges that Ephraimic tradition was to some extent forged in dialogue with and opposition to Bardaisanite forms. One of the interesting recent speculations is authorship of the Odes of Solomon, a mysterious collection of early Christian hymns composed in Syriac. They have long puzzled scholars with their blend of mystical language, high Christology, and poetic structure. Dated broadly between the late 1st and early 3rd century CE, the odes bear thematic and stylistic similarities to the kind of spiritual poetry attributed to Bardaisan and his son Harmonius. Some scholars have proposed that Bardaisan may have either influenced the Odist tradition or authored some of the hymns himself. Bardaisan's recovery is not just about rehabilitating a historical figure. It is a reframing of early Christianity itself. His legacy reveals a Christianity that was poetic, philosophical, cosmopolitan, and diverse. Bardesan of Edessa leaves us with a paradox, a thinker condemned by the Church, yet whose words, melodies, and metaphysical questions continued to echo in the Syriac world and beyond. He defied simple categorization, not Gnostic, not Orthodox, not pagan, but something more fluid, reflective of the intellectual borderlands he inhabited, between Rome and Parthia, Athens and Babylon, scripture and astrology. We've seen how Bardaisan's poetry helped seed later hymnody, and how his dialogues on faith and freedom flowed quietly beneath both Christian and Islamic thought. Though he was eventually eclipsed by Ephraim in Edessa, Bardaisan's legacy endured in the very tension that would come to define Eastern Christianity. His ideas would echo again centuries later in the writings of Renaissance humanists and early modern philosophers. As we turn the page, we move east to Persia and forward a few centuries to a very different fusion of ideas. Bardaisan dreamed of harmony between faith and freedom. The Koramites fought to make their vision of freedom real, in body, not just in soul. Join us as we enter the heart of Persia, where heresy became open revolt against the greatest empire of its time.